How U.S. calculated reciprocal tariffs. How rates were determined for each country explained. Economists say the formula can be reduced to a simple quotient of goods trade deficit over exports. They say tariffs are confusing to trade partners and unfair to poorer nations that cannot afford to import U.S. goods. More than 200 countries have to pay reciprocal tariffs that the Trump administration had introduced on April 2, with some of the worst offenders have to pay even higher rates. Most countries receive a base tariff rate of 10, but for countries receiving more, the rates were calculated by having a rate trump displayed as tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. But how exactly were these tariffs? Taxes on imports were calculated, and the U.S. Trade Representative USTR published an overview of the calculations on its site with a math formula it used to calculate each country's reciprocal tariff. Here's how that formula breaks down. So, the simple maths is take the trade deficit for the U.S. in goods with a particular country, divide that by the total goods imports from that country, and then divide that number by 2. A trade deficit occurs when a country buys imports more physical products from other countries than it sells exports to them. For example, the U.S. exported $143.5 billion in goods to China and received $438.9 billion in goods from China in 2024. After calculating the formula, its change in tariff import rate would be 67.3 and its listed value on the chart Trump held was 67. Similarly, when it applied to the EU, the White House's formula resulted in a 20 tariff. According to Reuters, economists say the formula can be reduced to a simple quotient of goods trade deficit over goods trade exports. The report describes the tariffs as confusing to trade partners and unfair to poorer nations that cannot afford to import U.S. goods. For example, Reuters reports that the European Union faces a punitive tariff of 24 times the 5 that the World Trade Organization reports as the EU's average tariff rate. The USTR memo states to conceptualize reciprocal tariffs, the tariff rates that would drive bilateral trade deficits to zero were computed. While models of international trade generally assume that trade will balance itself over time, the U.S. has run persistent current account deficits for 5 decades, indicating that the core premise of most trade models is incorrect. Nan Thomas Sampson of the London School of Economics told the BBC the formula is reverse engineered to rationalize charging tariffs on countries with which the U.S. has a trade deficit. There is no economic rationale for doing this, and it will cost the global economy dearly. A top trade analyst has said the Trump administration's calculations that led to the tariffs are not standard economics and in many cases impose rates far higher than those that the targeted countries apply to U.S. goods, reported news agency The Associated Press. Julia Spies, Chief of Trade and Market Intelligence at the International Trade Center, told the Associated Press uncertainties remain about the exact way the U.S. Trade Representative's office and other U.S. officials came up with the tariffs. She said the figures presented by Trump roughly match the U.S. trade balance or imbalance with a specific country, divided by imports from that country, and that, divided by 2, gives us the reciprocal tariff imposed by the U.S. Nan and many major U.S. trading partners have been hit hard by Trump's reciprocal tariffs. China is levied with a 34 tariff, which is additional to the existing 20 duties on all Chinese imports to the U.S., while the European Union gets 20. China and the EU accounted for around a quarter of U.S. total imports in 2024 and are in the top 3 suppliers of U.S. imports along with Mexico, according to U.S. Census Bureau data. Many Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia will see unprecedented tariff rates of 46 to 49. Americans rely on these countries for consumer goods, machinery, and electrical goods and textiles. Mexico and Canada are exempted from the list, but the existing 25 tariff on their exports to the U.S. that don't comply with the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement remains in place, except for Canadian energy and potash, which is taxed at 10. The additional country-specific reciprocal tariffs also will not add on to product-specific tariffs that have been announced on steel, aluminum, and autos. Nan